arrived at a pivotal moment. We are 10 years on from the Paris Agreement. The scientific community has been sounding the alarms around the risk of climate tipping points, and we're operating in a global context where multilateralism is under real strain and where geopolitical tensions are at an all-time high. And so expectations going into COP30 were very high, particularly for adaptation, which this webinar will focus on today. Well before the negotiations began, the Brazilian presidency had explicitly framed COP30 as both the adaptation COP as well as the implementation COP. And so this was meant to be a moment where adaptation issues, adaptation negotiation really came to the fore and up the ladder of priorities. The message from the presidency was clear that COP30 should focus less on what countries intend to do and more on how to actually deliver it. How do we scale finance? How do we build resilience? And how do we empower communities? But despite the strong framing and ambition, some of the negotiations faced deep divisions, which were to some extent expected across multiple aspects of the COP, which we will dive into in a second. And many decisions went down to the wire. And so reactions to the COP have been varied. Some were deeply dissatisfied, both in terms of the outcome and the process, bringing in a disappointment, and some calling for significant reforms to the process. Others pointed to small but important steps forward, and perhaps more importantly, a recognition that that progress must also come through coalition partnerships and collaborations beyond the COP, beyond UNFCCC process. So we'll come back to all of this. And today what we want to do is make sense of what happened around adaptation, the progress, the shortcomings, the political signals, and the implications for those working in this space. So I'm really delighted to welcome 4 speakers who are all experts on adaptation, different aspects of adaptation. We have Katie Harris, who's Senior Policy Fellow at the Stockholm Environment Institute, and through her work, she has a focus on global governance of climate change adaptation, and she's also the Director of Adaptation Without Borders. We have Tracy Kajumba, who's Director of Life AR Interim Secretariat at IIED. So Life AR stands for the Least Developed Countries Initiative for Effective Adaptation and Resilience. And there she provides technical and strategic advice and support to the least developed countries and the 10 Life AR countries. We also have Timo Leiter, who's a distinguished policy fellow at the Grantham Research Institute at LSE. He's been heavily involved in the adaptation negotiation, especially around the global goal on adaptation and indicators. And he co-facilitated the expert group on the GGA indicators. And finally, we have Cristina Rumbaitis del Rio, who's Senior Advisor on Adaptation and Resilience at the UN Foundation. And unfortunately, Cristina can only join us for the first half hour. I say unfortunately, but it's actually, we're very fortunate to have her today. So we're going to kick off with Cristina to make the most of her presence. This is going to be our agenda. The session today is going to be more conversational based. So we'll start with setting the scene with Cristina with a few questions, and then we will go into a deep dive around 3 key areas, 3 key adaptation themes around the COP30. We'll talk about adaptation finance, we'll talk about the global goal on adaptation indicators, and the NAP assessment. We'll then spend a little bit of time talking about what next for the post COP30, and finally we'll have times for Q&A. So if you've just joined in, Please note that you can share your questions in the chat and we will come back to them towards the end. So I'm going to stop sharing the slides and I'm going to bring in Christina to really kick off the session and talk about why this COP was built as an adaptation COP and what were really the hopes coming in. Christina, I'm going to spotlight you and hand
Thanks,
the
Alice.
floor to you.
Thank you so much, and thank you to weADAPT for hosting this discussion and conversation. It's really good to be able to come together as a community and process the results. I think I've had conversations with a lot of people, and I think we're all still in processing mode. But just to say, heading into COP, I think this was the first time in recent memory where the presidency really did a lot to highlight adaptation strongly. They wanted to put adaptation at the heart of COP30. They had a dedicated presidency letter just focused on adaptation just before COP. They really wanted to reinforce adaptation as one of the key pillars of the Paris Agreement. And I really credit the presidency for that. We haven't had that level of importance really put on adaptation in many recent COPs. And so it was really refreshing. And I think that built a lot of expectations on the outcomes, which of course it wasn't easy for the presidency to deliver on. But we can maybe get into that a bit more in detail.
Great, thanks, Christina. And yeah, really interesting to hear about, the fact that obviously they branded this as an adaptation COP, and so this meant that the expectations were very high. Can you talk through what was at stake geopolitically and for vulnerable countries going in?
Yeah. So, I mean, there were several issues on the agenda related to adaptation. First, I'll focus on finance. So Glasgow, COP26 was the last time I'd say we'd had a strong focus on adaptation, really launched a process to unpack the global goal on adaptation, create a framework for the global goal on adaptation, but also called for a doubling of adaptation finance from 2019 levels by this year. So this year, many donor commitments on climate finance, especially adaptation finance, are expiring, or early next year they're expiring. And so adaptation finance was really high on the agenda coming into COP. The need for a new goal on adaptation finance, and strong calls building from the LDC group, the least developed countries group, coming out very strongly for a call for tripling of adaptation finance by 2030, and then other groups coming in and adding support to that call for a new adaptation finance goal. The other issue, in addition to finance, is progress on the global goal on adaptation. We've had several work streams over the past 4 years to first develop targets for the global goal on adaptation, the UAE framework for global climate resilience, which was agreed 2 years ago, and then over the past 2 years, a process to develop indicators to really measure progress against those targets. Now, this year is really critical to agree on those indicators, and I'm sure Timo will tell us more about those. But the next global stocktake process starts next year and culminates in 2028. And we want to be able to have a strong assessment of where we are on adaptation. Where are we on both action and support? Where are we making progress? What are the gaps? Where do we need to do more? And in order to have that information, we really needed indicators to be agreed against the framework of the UAE framework. So those were two really critical issues, especially for vulnerable countries coming into COP. There's also the broader geopolitical issue of the US coming out of Paris, realignment on ODA and finances, reductions in ODA and climate finance. Beyond that, what does that mean in terms of adaptation? What does that mean in terms of support for vulnerable countries? Just as the need for adaptation finance is growing. And countries are putting out their plans, their national adaptation plans, and their NDCs, many of which have strong adaptation components. But let me stop there so we can carry on.
And thanks, Christina, and we'll come back in detail on all those points. But what's your sort of high level take about what happened at COP, and do you think it met the expectations going in of the adaptation COP?
Yeah, that's a tough one. I think we made a lot of progress. There was agreement on a goal to triple adaptation finance, which was really one of the biggest outcomes of COP, which I think is important because it really puts a stake in the ground and signals that adaptation can no longer be ignored and is a critical element of the Paris Agreement. But it's a longer time frame than what the LDC group was requesting. We still have a fuzzy issue with the baseline, which makes it less accountable, which incidentally was true with the doubling goal, but over time that got interpreted. And I think we really need to figure out what counts, what doesn't count. Is it a provisioning goal or a broader mobilization goal? Because it's in the context of the NCQG decision from last year. You know, it's something to work with, but further work will need to be done to really interpret that goal and, more importantly, get the commitments behind that target that's been set to triple by 2035. In terms of the global goal on adaptation, we did manage to agree on 59 of the 100 indicators that were put forward by the by the technical experts. I think that's actually an important step forward, though there were changes, wording changes to those targets, which definitely are worrisome and will need to be worked out. There's ambiguities on really what comes next and how we put these indicators into use, and how we continue to evolve the adaptation agenda and elevate the adaptation agenda within the UNFCCC system, really pivoting more towards implementation. So I think we made big steps forward, not as big as we had all hoped, and there's still quite a bit of ambiguity around the outcomes that will need further elaboration and interpretation going forward.
Great, thanks. That's really helpful. And before we go into those thematic deep dives, and after you have a drink of water, I was wondering if you could comment on the process of the COP. I mean, we knew going in that there was so much more emphasis being put on the inclusion, this COP being held on the edge of the rainforest and welcoming 3,000 members of indigenous communities to at least participate in the COP. Do you think it met the expectations of being a more inclusive COP?
Yes, I think it was a more inclusive COP. Whether that inclusivity carried through the process to the outcomes, I'm a little less sure. I mean, it was good to see protests being created, even celebrated at this COP. We haven't seen that also in a while. It was good to see the level of Indigenous participation in COP. But there were definite process issues. I referred to the changes in the wording of the GGA indicators, for instance. That really just happened out of the blue. A final text was provided. It was the first time indicators were actually listed in a draft text. and the wording had changed, and we don't know who was consulted, why the wording was changed. There was no real open plenary discussion of that, and that came out in the closing plenary where several countries came forward and objected to the GGA decision because of that, because it was felt that the wording and the robustness of the indicators had been reduced, and there hadn't been agreement around those indicators, which again adds to the ambiguity that we're in around those indicators and how they what happens next, how they move into use. So I would say there was more inclusive participation, but maybe not more inclusive processes and decision making, consensus building. I think we all would have wished that had been better than it was.
Thanks. Yeah, I think that's a really important point to also comment on the process of how these decisions are made. I'm going to bring in Tracy now. We're going to focus on the finance element, have a little deep dive on finance. And Christina, I'm aware you have to go in 10 minutes. So maybe I'll turn to you, Tracy, now. We know finance was high on the agenda, that it was a very politically charged issue. We know that Baku was labeled as the finance COP, but that this one, finance was still very high on the agenda. Could you give us a little bit of framing around why finance mattered at this COP, despite Baku being the finance COP, and what were the expectations going in?
Thank you, Alice. I think finance is always at the center, whether we put it on the agenda or not, as we've recognized. And there was a lot of work before COP, the coalition of finance ministers coming together to set up a target, the roadmap from Baku to Belém, with targets being set, and hoping that there will be something practical moving at COP30. But we also saw a push on doubling by 2025, as Christina mentioned, with a stronger trajectory calling for time-bound, accountable finance scale-up for adaptation. And also discussions around grants and loans, accessibility of finance, transparency. And these are issues around climate finance that we've been talking about for a long time. At the Bonn discussions, the LDC group came out strongly on the need to triple adaptation finance by 2030, building on the Glasgow commitments. And also the adaptation gap reports with the figures projections made there noted that based on the current trajectory, we are likely to miss the Glasgow target. So that was important for this COP, whether it was strong on the agenda or not. It sort of framed all the conversations, whether it's the indicators, because if we don't have finance to deliver climate action on the ground, what are the indicators going to measure anyway? So finance somehow weaved into all the themes. But we also note that from the developing countries, the credibility on this COP also hinged on finance integrity and delivery. From Baku, what is the way forward? What is being done at the moment? There were also lots of conversation before COP around financing, social protection, locally led systems, simple access to finance. For example, when the loss and damage funds were announced, the question was, can the LDC seeds access these funds quickly and in a simple and accessible way that is not going to create more bureaucracy? So, and also the predictability of the flows is also difficult given the statistics on what funding is available. So funding definitely became an important conversation across the different themes at the COP. Yeah.
Thanks, Tracy. Christina, anything else to add to that?
Yeah, maybe just to add, I think Looking forward, so I think many of the things that were missing from the adaptation finance target, the real clear language on access and quality of the finance, the sort of I think the original ask was grant-based, and that's not been carried over into the decision. I think all of that can be pushed for through the various processes that were initiated by this COP, like the 2-year climate finance work program, continued work under the GGA, as the finance goal is tied to the GGA as well. Excuse me. And so I think what we need to do next is interpret that the finance goal in terms of what's needed, in terms of the quality issues, the baseline. I think all of those issues, there's still a lot of room to work with, and I think that's some of the work that lies ahead of us.
Could you, either of you or both, comment on how the process around the adaptation finance negotiations took place, in terms of both in terms of length and in terms of processes, and also in terms of how the parties interacted, where were the political divisions and sort of divisions, but also convergence amongst parties?
Yeah, do you want to start with that, Tracy?
Okay, yeah, sure. Thanks, Christina. So, in terms of the negotiations, of course, yes, the new goal to at least triple adaptation finance by 2035 is one of the key issues of the Belém package. But I think it's a bit weak as well. There's establishing the goal, but then there's the actual tripling of the finance. And I think from the trend, from the Glasgow COP and all the calls on tripling now being pushed back again another 5 years, it seems to be dragging on and on and on without no clarity on the mechanisms for addressing finance. So the first option on at least developed countries tripling their provision of adaptation finance from public sources was the one that was a bit clear. But we also know from the geopolitics of order cuts and all that, do we see that happening? That is a question. The other options in terms of language, we're talking about urging, acknowledging, which really don't give us the clarity on how this is going to be done. As much as people celebrated the win in terms of that goal, but then the question is it actually going to happen? From the LDC perspective, we saw a proposal to triple finance by 120 billion by 2030, with support from small and developing island states, Africa group of negotiators. But we also saw opposition from other negotiating blocs like the EU and others. So still, the tensions around finance remain a problem from those that are providing and those that are expecting to receive the finance. And there were arguments of new targets might also affect new renegotiation of the new quantified goal. So the deadline for tripling finance does not really give us hope that things will move as fast as it is expected. Of course, there was a positive signal, but it's less ambitious from the proposals, especially from developing countries. And there are no binding obligations really to build the confidence that this is going to happen. So while there was recognition of the need to scale finance and the efforts to strengthen adaptation targets and all, but there's limited specificity on the sources of funding. Where is the funding going to come from? What are the modalities? What is the share of funding that is going to come as grants? And how does this support country-led access pathways, given the issues of complications with access to finance that have been discussed over and over? So it's a mixed bag of things, but with no clear goal of how all this access and provision of the funding is going to be done.
I'm going to turn to Christina because she has to go in 3 minutes, but I wanted to follow up on Tracy, what you were talking about. Is there a process for taking on those questions going forward in the post-COP30? So maybe, Christina, you can give us your final take, but also if you have an answer to this question, otherwise we can turn to Tracy after you've finished.
Yeah, thank you so much. And I'm sorry that I need to leave early because this is a fascinating discussion and I wish I could hear all of it. I guess the only thing I would add is just taking the arc of the year and remembering how when a new goal was proposed, so many forces said, no, it couldn't be done. This isn't the year to push for that. Wait, last year was the finance COP. Just focus on the indicators, et cetera. And while, as Tracy really eloquently described, the goal really falls short of the ambition needed, I do think there's a lesson in the persistence that was there pushing for adaptation finance and really led by the LDC group and other groups coming on board. But even in week one of COP, there was very strong opposition from a lot of developed countries expressed on a new goal. And I think that's why we got the goal that we did. It was watered down through that negotiation process. I will say that the Secretary General of the United Nations came out strongly in support of tripling adaptation finance with a strong call for that in the final days of COP, which was really great to see his leadership on that issue and helping to galvanize more support for that. In terms of where we work on these issues and try and address and interpret, as I've been saying, the goal to make it more functional, more ambitious, clearer. I think there's a couple places. One is obviously still through the GDA work program. Two is this new climate finance work program that's been launched. That's broader than just adaptation, but adaptation needs to be reflected very strongly within that. And then outside of the negotiation, I think it's really important that we keep momentum and focus on this target, on this goal, so it doesn't fall into a faraway goal that can be worried about in the latter years, because we won't get there if we wait. And so I think there's a need to keep pressure on donor countries to abide by their commitments, to make new pledges, to deliver on those pledges, to ensure that the quality is there, the country led access is there, et cetera. And so I think there needs to be a mobilization of advocates to keep this goal alive, especially as other issues will come up and maybe take precedent. And so I think it's really important that we don't let go of this goal in the coming years. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Christina, and really value your input and insights. So thanks for joining us. I know you have to go now, so we can.
Apologies.
Thank you, Tracy. What's your take on what needs to happen next, practically, to ensure scaling up of finance and to ensure transparency and accessibility, especially for the countries who need it the most?
Thanks, Alice. I'll really speak from the practical point of view. It's a bit complex given the current situation on climate finance and reduction of ODA and all that stuff. So without binding commitment, it means that delivery will rely on what is coming out from bilateral funding or MDB reforms, if they're successful, to increase funding for adaptation, but also country demand and possibly domestic resource mobilization, which is not moving very fast due to known problems of availability of funding. But then the robust transparency as well linked to the GGAs, as Christina mentioned, is one of those. But for me, if we don't define near-term milestones of what the adaptation trajectory is, or where is it going to come from, what kind of instruments are going to facilitate countries accessing funding and supporting locally led adaptation, I think it's going to be a problem. So I think part of the work should be to really work on defining what is needed in the near term, what are the sources, and how is it going to work for the countries. A lot of institutions are talking about reform in terms of access to finance, which is still the biggest problem for the least developed countries and SEEDs especially. We've seen Adaptation Fund, for example, open the local-led adaptation window and others. We've seen the GCF also trying to reform accreditation and others. But is there a time-bound process where these things will be done and countries can actually access the funding? Can we have metrics on when all these systems will work? It's such a massive process for countries to get through. Even before we push for more funding, even what is available is not being accessed. So the reforms on access really need to be fast-tracked. The transparency, there is a risk now of, we've been talking about double counting, tagging everything adaptation when it's not adaptation. So that's where the transparency work becomes really important, to have a standard of what is adaptation finance. Is it actually reaching the communities, the vulnerable communities experiencing impact of climate change? Do we have a reporting mechanism that is able to track this? And of course, making sure that government, civil society, and other small organizations on the front line are able to access, link to the access mechanisms. And of course, in this conversation, we're going to talk about NAPs and all, which are all hinged on countries being able to access financing. As Belém was tagged an implementation COP, I think it's important. And this conversation needs to happen along the year to look at how do we turn this into action, despite the challenges of accessing finance.
Thanks. I mean, it is very helpful because we've been hearing a lot about just the headline of tripling adaptation finance, but actually there's just so much more below it to keep in mind. Before we move on to the GGA indicators, could you just share final thoughts on, well, both the adaptation fund and finance for loss and damage? If there's anything you'd like to comment on those
Thanks,
points.
Alice. Loss and damage fund was another one. We celebrated success, of course, in Glasgow when the fund was established, and there was a call in I think last month on countries starting to access the funding. While it was acknowledged as central, but we also noted that the discussions focused on implementation, but there were no new pledges, and we know that the funding is still small as well. So there's no replenishment mechanism for the loss and damage fund. So there is frustration, of course, among vulnerable countries while the fund exists, but COP30 failed to secure predictable replenishment and operational clarity of the fund. In LifeAR, we're working with some of the countries that are trying to apply for the loss and damage fund and trying to get clarity on it. So it's still really work in progress. So symbolically, Christina talked about the riots on climate justice and protests on high extractive threats and all that, which links to the loss and damage in terms of the impacts. However, there was no new major commitments on loss and damage. So it's still work in progress. We also saw that negotiations stalled on the sources of funding, the scale, the governance. So some of the analysis that has been done are that the outcomes on loss and damage are incremental but very fragile, especially if no more funding is added into the pot to support loss and damage. So some of the conversations have been that funding should come from public budgets or private sector levies or other innovative sources, but we know that these sources are not clearly working. And we are talking about risk that needs to be addressed immediately. How this works, I don't know. So it remains unsolved on where the funds are going to come from. But there was also disagreement on how vulnerable countries could access the funds quickly and equitably. The civil society is pushing for simplified grant-based modalities, but outcomes on these are also still not clear. So, but in terms of implementation and practical steps, there's also a call to link that to early warning systems to ensure local level access, to integrate with disaster risk reduction. I think all these are processes that need to be worked through. Otherwise, it will be more of a symbolic act which is not backed by real money if there's no clarity on where the funding is going to come from.
Thanks, Tracy. I wish we had much more time to spend on adaptation finance, which is such a large topic. But we'll move on now to the global goal on adaptation and indicators, and which was one of the core priorities really going into the COP30 to finalize a set of indicators for the GGA, a process meant to provide clarity on how progress is measured globally. So I'm going to invite Timo and Katie to share their insights, and we'll kick off with Katie. Could you explain, give us a sort of could you set the scene around the global goal on adaptation and the indicators? Why do they matter, and why is this so important for the COP30?
Thanks, Elise. Very happy to. Although I'm always a bit nervous talking about the indicators when Timo's on the call, because he knows this process perhaps better than anyone, but I'm sure he can correct anywhere I've gone wrong. But the global goal on adaptation, it was established with the Paris Agreement, so 10 years ago. It's very common and very much within sort of popular consciousness, the mitigation target. So the target to keep global warming to below 2 degrees Celsius and to aim for only 1.5 or less degrees of warming. But fewer people know that there was actually an adaptation goal established at the same time, with the idea of placing mitigation, so the reduction of climate change, on a par with adaptation to climate change. And this of course, this global goal was agreed in Paris, but then very little has happened over the last 10 years. And one of the reasons for that has been that it was hard to operationalize. Unlike the temperature goal, there were no sort of quantitative metrics to work towards or to assess progress against. And so 4 years ago, as Christina mentioned already, 4 years ago in Glasgow, parties decided to try and give some definition to the goal and to build the architecture of the global goal on adaptation. And so they first of all launched a 2-year work program, so the Glasgow to Sharm el-Sheikh work program, that aimed to establish a framework, or the end result of the work program was a framework with 11 targets that gave greater definition to the global goal on adaptation. And these targets represented sort of both thematic areas to where we needed to adapt and sort of thematic focus areas, but also a series of process indicators. So how well are we doing at planning and implementing and monitoring our progress on adaptation? And then for the last 2 years, that was then superseded by the UAE to Belém work program. And that took that framework, which was called the UAE Framework for Global Climate Resilience. And the process has been underway to, as you mentioned, Elise, and as Christina has mentioned, to come up with some indicators that would assess progress towards the targets in that framework. And this sounds hugely technical, but actually the potential of these indicators in defining adaptation in the years ahead, in framing what gets planned or implemented or financed or assessed as adaptation in the years ahead, is really significant. And so even though it seems a very technical exercise to come up with these indicators, because one of the most significant challenges has been the how hard it is to really operationalize and assess our progress in adaptation as a concept. This has been a really critical work program. And actually, the decision on what gets included as an indicator or not is highly political. So it may seem like a very technocratic exercise. Oh, 2 years to come up with a series of indicators that are then discussed by all these parties, actually has potentially profound ramifications. So that was the context in which parties arrived in Belém. I'll let perhaps Timo explain a little bit more about the process to develop those indicators over the last 2 years, and perhaps take us up to that point when parties sat down in Belém to discuss.
Go ahead, Timo. Yes, you can unmic yourself.
Thank you very much, Katie. Thanks, Elise, and hi, everyone. And at the outset, I can say, there are many post-COP webinars, but this is the only one focusing exclusively on adaptation. So that's great. And great to be able to reflect on what happens and what it means for the way ahead. So as Katie said, so there has been this process leading up to COP30, where countries 2 years ago agreed on the framework for the global goal on adaptation, and then set out on a 2-year process to develop indicators. And so what happened going into COP30 was there an expert group was established last year in September, which I've been co-facilitating, and we are 78 experts, a very balanced and diverse group. And we had a list of about 500 indicators going into the session in June, the intersessional negotiations, and we received a very clear task: to reduce that list to no more than 100 indicators that are globally applicable. So I keep pointing out, this is about global assessment of progress. This is not about indicators for projects or for, national assessments, but this is a global assessment towards the 11 global targets. And another important point to make is, I often hear people saying, oh, 100, that's a lot of indicators. But we need to recognize that the 11 targets cover a wide breadth of topics. So every target has its subcomponents up to 5. So if you have 30 to 40 subcomponents and 100 indicators, that would mean only 2 or 3 indicators per subcomponent. So we, as the expert group, we really worked hard to reduce the list of 500 by 80% and get to the list of 100, which was submitted early September. And that was then discussed for the first time by parties at a mandated workshop in Bonn early October. And this is where we got the first flavor of how the list would be received by parties. And it turned out it wasn't too favorably received. So there were lots and lots of comments. Just to give you kind of 3 main reasons. One for dissatisfaction by parties. One was that, the Sony issue of means of implementation, differentiation, who has to pay. So developing countries insisted that indicators related to national budgets or financial taxonomies would get deleted. And then there were other parties who claimed that certain indicators would be about loss and damage. Even so, we as the expert group, we always used the wording of the targets as the basis, because that was our mandate, to develop indicators that track the targets as agreed in Dubai. But some parties claimed that some of the content of those targets would be loss and damage, and therefore wanted those indicators to be deleted. So these were kind of 2 main sources that why parties suggested the list to be shortened. So, but then after that workshop in October, there was no clear process going up to leading up to the COP. So at the start of the COP, we knew that parties had, dissatisfaction with some of the indicators, and that a lot of work would await the presidency at the COP. Yeah, but that was our input going into the COP.
Thanks, Timo. And so what happened at the COP, both in terms of, what were the final decisions, but also in terms of the process for how the decisions were made?
Yes, thanks. So there were three main decisions that parties needed to take at COP30. One was around the list of indicators itself. Would parties adopt the list of indicators? Would they welcome them? If so, how many? Then the second question was, what would the purpose of these indicators be? What would the text say about how countries are using them? And the third one was the follow-up work, because many of these indicators require metadata to still be developed. About 2/3 of them do not yet have agreed calculation methods at the global level, so it was clear that follow-up work was needed. So yeah, at the start of what was very surprising to me was that parties seemed to fall behind what was already agreed in Baku, because in Baku last year, parties had already agreed what the final nature of the outcome of this work program was supposed to be, namely a global assessment of progress towards the targets, including aggregation of indicators to the global level. But there were a number of party groups, most notably the Arab group, the like-minded developing countries, partially also the African group of negotiators, who seemed to fall behind what was already agreed last year. So that gave the presidency a hard time from the very beginning. And so the first sessions were really, some of the time was wasted to discuss again, what these indicators are for, what all of this is about. And there was a suggestion from the Group Azure, led by Uruguay, for countries to engage with the list in informal discussions so that they could agree, which indicators to remove and which indicators would remain. That proposal was also blocked by the Arab group, so it never got to a point where parties sat together in the room, be it in an INF setting or in an informal, to discuss the list of indicators. And my hypothesis, what happened then, is because the presidency really put all its weight to get a good outcome of this work program, that the presidency then took matters in its own hand and developed its own list. And so looking at what we have now, we got, in terms of adoption, a list has been adopted, and this was, in principle, this adoption was the best possible outcome, because there were various other scenarios that the list would not get adopted, that the list would only get being taken note of, that only very few indicators would be adopted and the rest would be deferred. So in principle, having an adopted list is a very positive outcome. However, and that was very surprising to the expert group and to myself, we didn't, there were not only a shortening of the list from what we had from the expert provided list of 100, but many of the indicators got significantly changed or even substantially changed, which means that some of the indicators are now much harder to measure than before. And some of the wording in some of the indicators is also very strange. So, for example, there is an indicator under health which says incidence of infectious diseases, including as an outcome of adaptation. So there are indicators which suggest a negative outcome of adaptation. And to me, it is very frustrating that the typical, not even the editorial, work that typically is done by the Secretariat seems to have been applied to this list of 59 remaining indicators. So about this list, which we now have, it's called the Belém Adaptation Indicators. The two weaknesses are that some of the components of the targets are no longer covered. For example, there's no indicator on mainstreaming of adaptation, even though this is such an important part of adaptation. Mainstreaming has been recognized as a key objective under the NAP process. And there are a few components which are not covered. And then there are some indicators where our sub-expert groups say they're very hard to measure, especially on health. And then there's some other targets which have very few indicators. Infrastructure has only 2. So that, of course, is leaves a little bitter taste, even so we have an adopted list. What is positive, on the other hand, is that the list which the experts had proposed is recognized as a knowledge product. So at least it is still there. We can build on it. Also, what is very positive that the presidency was successful to have parties agree on the purpose of the indicators. So the text invites parties to use the indicators in their reporting under the Paris Agreement. That's very positive. So the indicators have a clear purpose. It also recalled the decision from last year that this will inform the global stocktake. And this is really what all of this was about, to make the second global stocktake more an in-depth assessment of adaptation progress compared to the first global stocktake, which really said hardly anything about adaptation in detail. So these are the positive sides. Another really unfortunate aspect is that there's an outright contradiction in the adopted text, namely in paragraph 9, which states that global standardized methodologies or data collection processes shall not be created, which is the strongest possible wording. And then some paragraphs down, it says the very opposite, request the subsidiary bodies to develop exactly those methodologies and data collection processes. So I think if you ask me, the text that got adopted is the version that we would have typically seen one version before the text that gets adopted. So there are, and this is kind of, I think, what some of the frustration of the parties that arose at the end of week 2 was that despite all the consultations that happened on Friday after the text had been released, the text was left untouched, and not even some very fine things could have been done to the text to improve it, to get away with these contradictions, but these were not taken in the text. Basically, this is the only version of a complete text that was ever tabled, and then it was a take it or leave it. And I think this was one of the reasons why some parties in the closing plenary then said that they would object to the text.
Thanks, Timo. Tracy, I want to turn to you for your take on both the outcome and the process of the GGA indicator negotiations.
Thank you, Alice. Of course, Timo is the expert. So I'm going to come in from the practicality of it, things that were really interesting for me in terms of the negotiations. I think everything Timo is talking about brings us to the sort of conflict between political and technical roles on the indicators. Developing indicators is I should say, a technical kind of thing that people had worked on for years, I should say, to assess the metrics. Are they measuring this or that? And then you're bringing it to a group of people, possibly they've never developed any indicators. The time is not enough to look at all the indicators and decide if they are right or not. I'm seeing somebody in the chat also commenting how people didn't want to look at specific indicators. And I think there was a lot of politics from the Africa group of negotiators. They wanted a political refinement of indicators for another 2 years, meaning possibly people were not clear or didn't have enough time to really get into the details of the indicators. But one of the interesting statements was the note that some of the indicators were intrusive and countries needed more time to look at them. And they also needed to talk about adaptation finance that is needed to implement those indicators. I think this takes us to the practicalities of, can these global indicators be applied to a local context? How do we do the contextualization of global indicators at country level? I know lots of consultations have been done and all, but sometimes it's really difficult to resolve some of the issues in the negotiation rooms. So the divide between developed countries, developing countries, could be because of the different contexts we're operating in. The way we experience climate impact is different, and the things we measure are also different. And in practical terms, you'll see us as possibly male experts developing indicators and outcomes, which might be different for the local communities. If you ask them what kind of outcomes and change do they want to see, or countries. So I hope that there'll be a process of contextualizing these indicators. I know there's a work still going on. But also the other point is the finance. I know that nobody wanted to talk about the finance in relation to how do we actually do this. But like I said earlier, if you're not doing anything on the ground, there's nothing you're going to measure. So we can't have smart indicators, we can't have many indicators, but there's no finance to accompany the indicators. we'll still have nothing to measure. And sometimes they really get frustrated when we spend a lot of time on process, but when it comes to implementation and the financing to enable that to happen, we're still not going to have the right results at the end of the day. I'm not trying to be negative, but I'm just talking about the realities that we are working with. And there were also concerns around obligations and reporting and commitments that countries might have to get into. So as Timo says, it was really a mixed kind of response, no unified agreements in some areas. But of course, as we know that there's a 2-year process of the BELEM Addis vision, we hope that this will refine the indicators further, but most of all, letting the countries get involved into this possibly will come out with a proper framework that can work for everybody on adaptation.
Thanks, Tracy. Katie, do you have any sort of reflections on the indicator? I'm sure you do. There's also a couple of questions in the chat. I think this is definitely an area that is generating or a lot of questions. So maybe, I don't know if you've had a look at them around the indicators that were not included. Is there space to still include them or use them somehow? Etc. So I don't know if you could sort of share your thoughts on those as well.
Sure, very happy to. Maybe just to summarize then what I've heard from Timo and Tracy, and also add my own thoughts. So a colleague of mine, Katie Brown, sort of framed these indicators, or this decision on the indicators, as sort of ultimately it was the result of a performance of evidence-informed policymaking that failed to survive political reality. And I think what happened with these indicators, really raises bigger questions about whether the way the current negotiations are structured in this multilateral setting are really conducive to significant advancements in progress. Since the Paris Agreement, and particularly the rulebook for the Paris Agreement, was agreed, the negotiations are becoming increasingly technical. But here, for instance, we saw that this original list of 100 indicators that had been crafted through multiple years of effort by leading experts and parties over this long protracted process, were stripped down and rewritten at speed with minimal consultation, and as Timo said, they really differ significantly from what came before. So we shouldn't call these the streamlined set of 59. These are a new set of 59, and as Timo mentioned, that in many cases they've been reworded to really compromise their relevance to adaptation, or in ways that introduce really severe, maybe even insurmountable technical challenges. There is going to be a lot of work to do to make them credible, measurable, legitimate going forward. And of course, as we've heard as well, that the final decision really leaves major ambiguities about that follow-up work, the lack of clarity and coherence that we've heard, the internal contradictions within the text. And this BELEM to Addis vision on adaptation really raises more questions, I would say, than it answers at this stage. And it also perhaps signals a bit of a reduced reliance on technical expertise within the development and the refinement of these indicators, and introduces yet sort of another protracted political process. So for me, it really raises questions about how well suited the UNFCCC negotiations are to negotiate what is highly technical, in often cases, expert-driven work. The process to craft indicators that are robust, that are measurable, is really it should be an expert-driven process. And I would say that there are serious questions that remain about the indicators that were dropped, and whether they might return later. This, I think, raises questions for how willing parties are to sort of really test and implement and try and operationalize the set we've got, until we know what that process looks like. Particularly from SEI's point of view, all of the indicators that we were really championing that would have helped us measure adaptation to some of the more complex and compound and cascading and transboundary risks that the IPCC have recognized, that previous decisions at COPs have recognized, and indeed that the Paris Agreement recognizes in sort of recognizing the global nature of adaptation. All of those have been removed. So that for us is a big concern, and we don't yet know what are the opportunities to in the future to take a look at some of those indicators that didn't make the set, or to further refine them in a concrete way going forwards.
Thanks, Katie. We have a lot of questions on indicators. I think we should have done a whole webinar on this topic. Maybe what I'll invite you to do is, if you can answer some of those questions. So we've got one actually on cross-border risk, which I think, Katie, you've alluded to. There's one on the IPCC as well. So if you can answer them in the chat, you're welcome to. Otherwise, if we have time, we'll come back to those at the end. I just want to spend a little bit of time on NAP assessment. We'll try to keep this quite brief so we have time to come back to the questions. So we know that this year, countries were expected to submit or update their NAPs, and a priority at COP30 was to finalize the assessment of progress in the development and implementation of NAPs. So, Katie, I'm going to turn to you around what NAPs are and what the expectations were and priorities in the lead up to COP. And then we'll discuss what happened at COP around NAP.
Sure, and I really welcome the inputs from others on this too. So NAPs and National Adaptation Plans, they are basically, we've heard them called in the past sort of roadmaps for resilience, but it's where countries plan their adaptation efforts. We're increasingly seeing adaptation also reflected in NDCs, or nationally determined contributions. But particularly sort of targets and goals of adaptation actions in NDCs. And if you think about NAPs as the sort of the operational plan, how are we going to adapt? What's that going to look like? What do we actually need to do? And so going into COP30, parties were looking to discuss the assessment of progress. So where are we in the formulation and implementation of NAPs around the world? And COP30 concluded that assessment. And the text was notable for many reasons. Just before I turn to Timo and Tracy for their thoughts as well. So the text really acknowledged, which I think was important, the challenges faced by developing countries in formulating and implementing NAPs due to insufficient finance, due to the issues we've already discussed here, and other forms of sort of the means of implementation, as we call them. It really recognised that different parties are at different stages in the process. And the final report did a really good job of sort of recognizing and capturing some of these gaps and some of the challenges that we're seeing across the formulation of national adaptation plans around the world. So downscaling climate data and information, for instance, which is a real challenge. However, there was sort of a lack of really specific or concrete language on strengthening the means of implementation, and it sort of failed to mention indeed any sort of real sources of finance, including the private sector, and only really noted these with concern. So it doesn't sort of really spur any new, there's no impetus there for actually improving access. The text recognises that the inclusion of NAP guiding principles in the design and implementation of NAPs is fundamental. So it recognised Indigenous peoples and local communities and the role they play. There's a lot of language around the need for them to be gender responsive, to be highly participatory processes. Although we did see that intergenerational equity was removed from the text. And then, but we also saw a reference to the mainstreaming of adaptation. So how you would, and the importance of integrating adaptation into relevant development plans and sort of broader processes at different levels, even though the word mainstreaming, interestingly, isn't actually explicitly said. So it was good to see progress on this topic. It was good that this that this assessment was concluded. But again, I would say, like the adaptation finance and also like the adaptation global goal on adaptation, we're not seeing the sort of transformational step change that we need if we're really going to support countries around the world to not only plan but implement their adaptation efforts. We need to much sort of scale up support for these adaptation national adaptation plans to a much higher degree.
Thanks, Katie. Tracy and Timo, can I turn to you for sharing your thoughts on what happened around NAP assessment?
Yeah, just a very short point I would add before then. Sorry, Tracy. Do you want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay, just a very short point to add on NAPs, and then later on, I would answer the questions that we have here in the chat. So on NAPs, I was in the room on LDC Matters, which is another negotiation room next to NAPs, where the new updated technical guidelines for the NAP process that were just concluded this year were for discussion to be included in the text. And very unfortunately, the Arab group insisted on deleting any mentioning of the new NAP technical guidelines in the text. The guidelines do include a chapter on financing, but there was no chance. The Arab group insisted against all other groups to remove any reference. So in the NAP in the LDC Matters text, you do not see any reference of the NAP technical guidelines. That was very unfortunate.
If I may come in, then thanks, Katie and Timo, you've captured most of the things. But just to add on, is the recognition of the dependencies on adaptation on the other things. And I think these conversations also take us back to look at the low priority adaptation usually gets. It doesn't go away somehow. In some of the interesting things, not very interesting, but surprising things, I should say, is not wanting to talk about finance in relation to the NAPs, and yet we know without financing, the NAPs cannot be implemented. Some of the groups did not want to reference financing as part, Katie talked about the means of implementation. So there was a request for the Standing Committee on Finance to include information on finance flows for NAPs, but this was rejected. So we know that we have lots of NAPs, even the few that have been developed by countries, they are not being implemented. So it's looking at other programs and how NAP is being implemented in countries. But what was also surprising is some of the groups contesting the language on specific needs and special circumstances of LDCs and SIDS, which we've been using for years. And for adaptation, we're looking at vulnerability, which is different for different countries, different individuals. But it's surprising that we're still even discussing this as a problem. And I think what this takes us to, Katie briefly talked about inclusion. While there was convergence on need for capacity support, standardizing methods, and finance linkages. But this happening in practice is still a challenge. Also, the linkage with the GJ work on the indicators with what Timo is sharing as challenges. So there is a problem on how this can really support adaptation and how we are able to track if adaptation is really on track with all the chaos around indicators. But one of the other things is, yes, the gender and inclusion and all that stuff. Some of it was mentioned, but when you go to the gender negotiations, I was trying to read and follow on gender negotiations, which were also interesting, where we're going back to the basic definition of what is gender. which is really interesting in this era that we're still back there. And the whole trend from Bonn, those who go into negotiations, you'll know about the brackets, where you're looking at 275 brackets on gender. Then they increased 496. Yes, there was agreement on the new gender action plan, which people think it's a bit stronger than the previous one, but it's really a struggle on getting consensus on some of these things, which are really important for adaptation. So there's still a lot of work to do there in terms of, but if we don't resolve the financing issue and how the global goal links to adaptation, I think we are still continuing to have gaps and having data that is not really accurate.
Thanks to you three on this. I wonder if there's any final comments before we move on to what next, and then we'll come back to all of the questions on the GGA and potentially other topics if there are other ones. So
I'm happy to answer the questions.
If you don't mind, if we just focus on the last part, and then we'll come back to the questions. So in terms of just wrapping up, or actually, you know what? Let's focus on the questions now, because that did seem to generate quite a lot of interest. So there's actually, I think, almost three categories of questions. There's quite a few of them. One was around some of the scope and future of the indicator framework. One is on more of the methodological and technical challenges, and maybe a last round of questions was around the science policy alignment around the indicator. So Timo, yeah, feel free to answer the ones that you think are more important.
Thank you very much. And yeah, thank you very much for all these questions. And first, I wanted to also share an interesting note again from the negotiation room, because apart from the MOI indicators, what we observed was not the traditional developing parties, country parties against developed country parties, but it was basically all parties against the Arab group and the like-minded developing countries and parts of the African group. So all the others, Latin America, small island development states, developed countries, were very much in favor of the list of 100 indicators and of using the indicators. Like coming into the COP, I had expected to be much more discussion on the finance and MOI indicators. Instead, the beginning was, as I mentioned, discussing in general, what are we doing here? What are these indicators supposed to do? Even so, that had already been agreed in Baku. So, and so ultimately, there are now only 3 indicators on MOI. So that the negotiations unfolded very differently than what many of us had expected. But coming to the specific questions, so one listener asked if the list was decided behind closed doors. Yes, very much so. Most negotiators actually saw this list for the first time on Friday morning when it was published. And so this was a very much behind closed doors session. And, unfortunately, if on the while it was great that the presidency put all its weight behind getting a list adopted, that gave those parties which wanted to block that very strong leverage. So it is quite possible and speculated that some of this new text of the indicators is actually coming from the Arab group. I don't have confirmed evidence of this, but it's quite likely. So, now coming to the other questions and what this means and on the way forward. So someone asked, or Nella asked, if the list of the 100 indicators can be used to improve the indicators. So again, it is very positive that the decision text recognizes the list of 100 as a knowledge product, which gives us a possibility to refer back to it. However, paragraph 23, which is about future work, does not mention fine-tuning or improving the indicators. And this is one of the things, like a small adjustment to the text that could have been made to help us to improve those indicators. So currently the list of 59 is set in stone. Even so, some of the wording, even the English, should have been, didn't get proofread. In terms of the follow-up work, so this is also one of the things that lets me conclude that this text wasn't ready for adoption, because there are many duplicative, overlapping, and unclear things which are supposed to be done over the next 2 years. There is the Belém to Addis vision, then there is a technical paper, then there is an invite to develop tabular formats, but it's not even clear if that's supposed to be done for all indicators or just for the MOI indicators. There's going to be a technical task force, but there's a very important difference to the current expert group, because unlike the current expert group, which we are under the SB chairs, the new task force is under the SBs. And the key difference is that means every single detail has to be agreed by every party. So this task force cannot even start before the June session. So nothing on the task force can happen before June. And in theory, not even the selection of members could be done without party approval, which would bring this to a year from now. Another major concern is that under the Bellem to Others vision, the metadata development, and this is one of the questions in the chat, could be delayed by 2 years, because it is worded as if the metadata would then be approved only in Addis Ababa. But the metadata, which means the standardized method to actually report in a consistent way, is of course key to have a reliable way of measurement. So there are quite some concerns here. We, of course, on the positive side, the text does include a call for international organizations to work on these indicators. So, we have some things going in the right direction in the text, and we have some things where there's still quite some, uncertainties. But what I can say from the expert group, the mandate of the current expert group is ending with the COP, but we have convened, I've convened a call for our expert group 2 weeks ago. We remain dedicated and committed to this process, and we will make ourselves available and try to do everything to improve the indicators within these different entry points that now exist, the technical paper, the task force, however it looks like, and the follow-up work. So we will try to do that. And to the final question from Richard on the IPCC. So the IPCC is updating the technical guidelines for assessing climate change impacts and adaptation. However, the IPCC will not come up with a list of indicators and will say, this is the list of indicators. So that's quite different. And also because the Arab group has been blocking the decision on the release date of the 7th assessment cycle, we don't even know if if AR7 will come out in 2028 or 2029. So this is 4 years from now. So our focus is on the next year and the following year and trying to improve the indicators and make them operational.
Thanks. That was very comprehensive and really useful. Lots of useful insight. Katie and Tracy, would you like to add anything or answer some of the?
I have a question, which I'm just taking off my speaker's hat and turning to a question. To Tracy or Timo. Do you know, so going into this, there was some discussion about the Baku Adaptation Roadmap, otherwise called the BAR, with I think different people thinking or different parties thinking, is this something sort of instrumental, or is it not when it comes to sort of the adaptation negotiations? So with I think some parties proposing to conclude it, others saying we should keep it as a means for sort of supporting the implementation of the GGA or bringing coherence to the UNFCCC adaptation architecture. We know adaptation is really dispersed across different items. Do you know what happened on the BAR?
Yes, the BAR makes the picture more incoherent. And I think this is very important for all to know, because I see so many publications on speculations on what this BAR could or presumably would be doing. It is very important to recall what happened in Baku. The BAR was never decided by consensus by the groups. It was something that entered the presidency text in the last moment, and it was tabled as a take it or leave it text. So many parties were really unhappy with the Baku adaptation roadmap. There is not even a roadmap to this, right? Nobody really knows what this is about. And therefore, interesting, there was also quite an alliance across developing and developed countries, wanting to end it. But again, this is something that is really dear to the Arab group, so it was kept. But it was interesting that many parties, the African group of negotiators and the EU and others, insisted that the future indicator work is not under the BAR, but is something separate. And therefore, you see that all of this follow-up indicator work is not under the BAR. So the scope of the BAR has now been broadened by the decision text, but what exactly it would be doing, apart from 2 workshops, nobody really knows. But this is not the place where the indicator work would continue.
And now I've thought of one more question. Sorry. But finally, there was a high-level dialogue on adaptation that happened in Belém that I had high hopes for, that felt like they fizzled a bit flat on the day. But I wonder if either of you have thoughts on that, or indeed this broader question of from now to sort of COP31, given this tough geopolitical, socioeconomic climate, what can we do to sort of keep the or raise adaptation sort of up the political agenda? And did this dialogue help with that?
So on the, what was very unfortunate that the dialogue happened during the second week and took resources from the presidency adaptation team away at an absolutely crucial moment. To be very honest, nobody needed this dialogue in week 2 at such a crucial moment. So yes, there were talks, but practically speaking, I think it achieved very little. And it would have been better if it hadn't occurred or had occurred in a different way or during week 1 or a short or something. But actually, this is also not the first time. Going back to Madrid, COP25, we already had a high-level dialogue on adaptation. And very practically speaking, it is a few people coming up and speaking, and that's it. So this is not going to bring any substantial changes. It is more, and that's a very unfortunate tendency that we see more. Every presidency wants to attach its name to something. So we're creating more and more dialogues and forums and roadmaps and whatnot. We're just bringing incoherence to adaptation rather than coherence.
If I may come in, I was not in Belém in the second week, but basically to comment generally on adaptation conversations and events that I attended. Like Christina said at the start, I think I'm still trying to absorb what this COP was all about many weeks after. There is the urgency on adaptation, and for us to focus on implementation than all these conversations that are going on and on and on. That was a key messaging. And I also attended some of the finance sessions, private sector philanthropy, with funny language as well around how do we make adaptation bankable. But the interest is there, is all I can say. But one of the things is everybody's also tired. We are repeating ourselves over and over and over again. I was happy to hear in a number of sessions that question coming up. Can we use what we have to scale out adaptation? Because we are mourning about money year in, year out. We come and complain COP has not delivered. And we are not achieving much. What can we do differently? I think for me, that was a strong message. Even in the events I was called to speak, I realized I was talking about the same things, and I was thinking possibly we should stop speaking at all and get to work. So there is that urgency. But of course, the challenges still remain, which we need to work through. But some of the things I think we haven't touched on that I wanted also to bring in is the NDCs. There was a lot of excitement on NDC 3.0. How do we take this forward? And I'm saying this because most of the NDCs are largely adaptation. Half of them are largely adaptation, not mitigation. But there was no opportunity to have these conversations. And according to the numbers, 121 countries have submitted, but 76 are missing the targets. So I think we can already think what the IPCC report is going to produce. TIMO is part of that process. So all these processes have fallen behind, and they also have an impact on adaptation. And the lack of a roadmap on the phase out for fossil fuels. I'm sure you saw the news and the campaigns and everything. That was really also very disappointing that it didn't happen. And we've been talking about the triple crisis: climate, nature, poverty, but all the conversations also around nature and deforestation did not also progress. We hope that across the year, some of these conversations will happen. But I think as we look at COP31 as adaptation community of practice, I think we need to think of the practical things that we need to do. There are some unresolved issues, of course. Adaptation finance is one of those. We can't keep quiet. Yes, it's difficult, but the conversations need to go on to challenge around access, commitment. Finalization of the indicators is already complex, as Timo has shared, but we still need to keep this conversation going to see what could change along the way. But also the loss and damage scale out is another area that we need to tackle in terms of what are the practical things that can be done other than the disappointments and all that. So yeah, that's what I wanted to add.
Yeah, lots to ponder on the COP processes. I know Timo had to go. I don't know if he's still here. If he is, Timo, you're welcome to share final 30-second thoughts on the COP as a whole, or the COP process in general, if it's still fit for purpose, and if not, what are the priorities in the year ahead? But I think he may have been gone. Maybe Katie and Tracy, I don't know if you want to share a final round of thoughts on this topic, on, if, as you say, a lot of experts are tired of repeating the same thing. And, if you share your priorities for the year ahead, will they be followed, respected? And if not, what are the alternative processes that we should focus on? Both of you, if you want to share final reflections on that.
Maybe I can go first and then give Tracy the last words. Yeah, I think for me, with the conclusion of this work program, I've been following these two work programs over the course of the last 4 years, and there's a moment now to pause and reflect and take stock where we are. And I think my colleague Richard Klein has been on the call, and he has been quite vocal in encouraging us to rise above the very technical discussions on indicators. I mean, Tracy, you mentioned before, it doesn't matter how much we try to measure if the substance, the matter, isn't there to begin with. And I think as I look towards the year ahead, it's there's a lot of question marks over what the process will be, what the year will look like on adaptation under the UNFCCC. There's a lot of questions also on the new setup with for COP31 that will be sort of jointly hosted by Australia and the Pacific and Turkey. And I hope for the next year that there is somehow some renewed impetus, an injection of imagination, of drive, of momentum on adaptation. I think everybody is ending this year tired, and yet we can't afford, given the threats that climate change pose to so many, but particularly the poorest and most vulnerable, we can't afford to lean into that apathy and to accept that this is the best we can do. So I want to see coalitions of the willing next year. I want to see innovative ideas coming out. I want to see us focus on the possibilities rather than get looped into the discussions on the challenges regarding the geopolitics and the limited financing, so on. And I would really like next year, 2026, for it to be an exciting year for adaptation that particularly gives all of us in this call some energy and some things to look forward to. Tracy.
Thank you, Katie. I think I couldn't have put it better. That's the spirit. I'll just mention 2 points really to build on what Katie has said. We have to keep going, and we need to keep the pressure politically for finance credibility. We keep talking about the lack of, but even what is available is not being accessed. So institutional reforms that can enable access to adaptation finance, MDBs, multilaterals, and all these frameworks have been put in place. We don't need new ones, but how can we work on what is existing, what is successful, to scale it out, there has been a lot of conversation on mechanisms like social protection and early warning and SDGs and disaster risk, massive pieces of work that bring everything together. But we are always looking for something new to present. So I hope that we're able to reflect and build on what is already successful and scale that out while we're also calling for new commitments. But technically as well, some of the conversations we've had today, there are a number of gaps. We need convergence on the indicators, for example. Can we pilot more results that we can scale out? Instead of making things more complex, because the complexity we recognize does not work, but we really like it, creating new words, new terminologies, new frameworks. I hope that we really, as a community, build on what is working and try to scale that out in a positive way. Thank you.
Thanks, Tracy, and thanks to our 4 panelists. I thought it was a really rich conversation, and I'm definitely taking a lot away from the conversation. There's a few resources that were shared in the chat, which I encourage you to have a look at, including there's a blog by Katie, there's a COP30 debrief by LSE. Also, do check out Tracy's work through Life AR, lots of really interesting work. So I'll leave it there, and thank you all for attending. We'll share the recording of the session on the weADAPT platform, so do watch out for that. Thank you all. Thank you so much.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you.